Hello guys, welcome back to Java Fanatics. And the topic of our today's discussion will be about identifiers. So what is an identifier? In layman's term, an identifier, you can think of it as a name, something that identifies you from the rest of the others. So even in Java, we do have identifiers. So identifiers, when you name your variables, those names that you put there, we call them identifiers. So there are rules that you have to follow when you give your variables names or your entities or object names in Java. Rule number one is that the name of an identifier must begin with a symbol, must begin with a dollar sign, underscore, or it must begin with a letter. Of course, even though we are told that it must begin with an underscore or a dollar sign, we will see in our future tutorials that, or even in this video if time permits, that there is a recommended way of naming your variables or of having your identifiers, which is called camel case. But okay, let me come back to the rules. Is that your identifier must begin with a letter or a symbol or a dollar sign or an underscore. And then after which it can be followed by numbers or other letters. But a letter on its a number on its own is not permitted to begin an identifier. The name of an identifier cannot begin with a number. We will see that in code shortly. Again, is that we cannot have the same name as a received Java keyword. And then identifiers must have different names, both locally or outside inside an enclosing class, in which case we'll be talking about class or instance variable. So let's see rule number one in code. We say an identifier must begin with a letter or dollar sign or underscore. So this is our code here, guys. So our identifier is allowed to have a dollar sign as its name only, but this is not recommended. Like I said, an identifier, the name must always make sense. If you say sum, then we know that this will hold the sum of something, although we don't know what sum would be in there, but it will hold sum. Or you can say age. If you say age, we understand. But if you just say a dollar sign, it doesn't make any sense to somebody who will be reading it. So the practice is that your identifiers must be meaningful. They must, like when you look at an identifier, you don't have to ask yourself questions. It must speak for itself without you having to ask. That is what we mean. However, although a dollar sign on its own is permitted to be a complete identifier, an underscore isn't allowed. But if you add some more things on an underscore, then it is allowed to become an identifier. Also, we talked about it beginning with a letter. You cannot have an identifier start with a number. You cannot have an identifier start with an operator. So the only things that are permitted to begin the name of identifier is any letter, it's underscore, it's a dollar sign. All others, they aren't permitted to begin the name of an identifier. Also, we saw that an identifier can't use the same name as a Java received keyword. So here we see we cannot have name as 4 because 4 is used somewhere in Java. You cannot even have new because it's used somewhere in Java. You cannot even have throw because it's used somewhere in Java. You cannot have native. All these Java keyword are not are not permitted to be used as an identifier. But you can have int string, although string is used somewhere, but this is definitely not right. You are saying int string. This doesn't even make sense to begin with. So we are not allowed to do something like this. Our identifiers must have a valid, purposeful, meaningful name that has a purpose. All right. So now we also talked about class variables and instance variables. They too cannot have same names. So you cannot have something like this. This is not permitted. Also, the rules that applies for local variables, they also apply for instance variables and class variables. So once you put a modifier static here, this variable becomes a class variable. It's no longer an instance variable. We'll talk more about class variables and instance variables as well as local variables in future tutorials. But must be aware that the names must not be the same. The same goes to local variables. So any variable that is within a function, a method, is regarded as a local variable. So you cannot have something like this in here, guys. So that's it, guys, with regard to identifiers and roles in Java. I hope you enjoyed the video tutorial. Please don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next session.